Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Poetry Thursday, miserable, despised little BookTube event in which a few BookTubers pull down some poetry off their shelves and talk about it. I love Poetry Thursday videos, but I don't get enough of them by any means. And I had thought, I took my last poem for Poetry Thursday from this thing, The Making of a Sonnet, this new W.W. Norton anthology that I found at the Brattle, and I have been just loving this thing. Good Lord. I mean, it's the perfect yardstick of what I'm talking about, that anthologies like this live or die by who puts them together. In this case, a great editor and a great, unfortunately, late and great Irish poet put this together and did a fantastic job. The minute I spent any amount of time in this, I knew that I was going to be using this anthology forever, and I kind of thought, well, okay, we'll do a whole bunch of readings from The Making of a Sonnet. We'll do a whole bunch of them. And maybe we still will, but we won't be ranging all over this book if we do. Because, of course, I completely lost track of time. I completely lost track of how much September there was left in September. Now, in my own defense, that partly the reason for that is because it's been in the mid-80s to 90 with 95% humidity for the last 225 days consecutively in Boston. It's been tropical weather here, and when it's tropical weather day after day after day after day after day, when merely standing outside without moving causes you to be drenched in sweat, when you need to take a shower after every single exertion and then just lay there in air conditioning, that starts to take on a timeless quality. Any of you who lived in the tropics, I've lived in the tropics, and I've also lived in the tropics without air conditioning. I lived in Kuala Lumpur when it was not the 100% air-conditioned mega that it is now, when it was a beautiful, wonderful, character-filled place, but there was almost no relief from what was rampant heat and humidity. When that happens, you sort of lose track of time. It's certainly, as I've said many times on this channel recently, it certainly hasn't felt like autumn at all. But we're out of September. September is almost over, and of course, for October is Victober. October is BookTube's great, venerable celebration of all things Victorian. One of the only absolute must-attend events of the BookTube social calendar. So, of course, all of the poems that I'm going to read in October are going to be from the Victorian era. I think there are quite a few of them in here, but we're not going to be rambling all around. We're certainly not going to be doing anything contemporary. So for today, I thought I would do a contemporary poem by a poet who I have reviewed. I believe I reviewed this author's last collection, the very last collection of poems that he did, or it might have been the one before that, and also a poet whom I've interviewed in person in pre-COVID days. The poet is C.K. Williams, an oddly avuncular, oddly patrician kind of literary figure, working up in his attic, setting aside times, being austere and full of decorum and interviews, really giving off, I think largely unintentionally, giving off the feeling of a kind of last of his kind, an avatar of a different literary age. And that often shows in his poetry. His poetry is often, there are some things that I don't like about it, but his poetry is often formal. Just a tiny veneer of unknowability between the narrator of the poem's voice and the you and the reader. It's not formal in the sense that we would use usually, that I would use usually on Poetry Thursday, because very little of his verse is actually formally structured. There's usually very little in the way of formal scansion. But, well, you'll see what I mean. There's a kind of a stiffness, almost, well, it cracked him up when I suggested this, but I'm not sure if his laughter wasn't ironical. I'm not sure if he agreed with me, but almost as if some of his poems were being narrated by an alien who had inhabited the body of a human, but had no lived human experience. His exact response to that observation many years ago was, well, aren't we all? But anyway, this is called The Doe. And it's by C.K. Williams. I don't have a date on it, but it's the 20th century. He's gone now. So, near dusk, near a path, near a brook, we stopped. I in disquiet and dismay, for the suffering of someone I loved, the doe in her always incipient alarm. All that moved was her pivoting ear, The reddening sun shining through transformed to a color I'd only seen in a photo of a child in the womb. Nothing else stirred, not a leaf, not the air, but she startled and bolted away from me into the crackling brush. The part of my pain which sometimes releases me from it fled with her. The rest, in the rake of the late light, stayed. I want to point out a few things here. First of all, I mean the opening line: near dusk, near a path, near a brook. Notice it's not any of those things. It's just near those things. And despite the fact that it's not any of those things, it's not at dusk, it's not on a path, it's not at a brook, it's near all of those things. But despite that fact, despite the fact that it's not at any of those things, I think that the repetition, near, 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 actually has the effect of pulling us close to the action. And I really like that. There are some things in this poem, C.K. Williams' ticks, that I don't like. Disquiet and dismay seems to me to be padding out a line, and every single sentence, every single syllable in a poem is valuable real estate. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe he wanted the repetition to go along with near and near. I like the phrase "always incipient alarm." In does, they're never quite relaxed. And I love, you'll notice, it's not really poetry. I mean, it's lovely, but it doesn't have any reason for existing in the form that it exists. All that moved was her pivoting ear, the reddening sun shining through, transformed to a color I'd only seen in the photo of a child in a womb. I'm sure you know that. The poet is describing something I'm sure you have seen yourself. Whether it's a wild animal, I've seen it in wild animals many times, including in the ears of an elephant, when the sunlight catches this, what is really a flap of skin that has blood vessels in it. The sunlight is sort of a muffled, very organic, almost womb-like muted red. You might have seen it through your own eyelids, or through the webbing of your hand, or through the ear of a cat or a dog at sunset. It's always arresting when it happens, and it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful little thing. It's a thing that we've all seen, we've all experienced it, and the poet is describing it and doing a fairly good job of it. I always think that's a valuable thing about poetry. I love poetry when it does that, when it suddenly shines a spotlight on some tick, some reflex, some phrase, some way of thinking, some little sight, the delicacy of a cat lapping at cream, whatever the thing is, whatever the moment is. I love it when poetry goes right into that moment and inhabits it for us, suddenly, permanently, as opposed to a passing image that you don't remember until the next time you see it. I like that very much. And I also like the way C.K. Williams' poems tend to do this, the way everything complicates and tangles at the very end. I think that's neat. I like the crackling brush. I like that a lot. I remember that sometimes when I hear, for instance, when I'm out walking in the woods with Frida, and we hear a crackling in the brush. When we hear that, I always think of this poem, even though it's usually just a squirrel. The thing about walking in the woods, especially if it's been a while since you've seen a human, if it's been 30 or 40 minutes since you've been anywhere near where humans are, a noise in the woods will always feel louder than it really is. But what I'm talking about here for that tangling up at the last minute is that last bit, that last stanza. I hesitate to say stanza. These things don't need... I'm not going to pick a fight with a dead author this time, but I want to read that last stanza again. The part of my pain which sometimes releases me from it fled with her. The rest, in the rake of the late light, stayed. And that last line is wonderful. Rake, late, and stayed. That kind of boom, boom, boom in terms of the sound neatly echoes the near, near, near of the first line. That's well done. It's kind of interesting that the poet, the narrator of the poem, never really explains why any part of his pain would jump off with the deer. Why some of it would stay, sure, but why would any of it leave? Until, again, you remember that sometimes that is exactly how it feels. You will be caught up in pain, thought of your own. You will see something that has no connection with you whatsoever. It's almost always the natural world. you'll see something that has no connection with you whatsoever. It's going its own way, whether it's reacting to you or not. The case that came to mind when I read this poem recently, the case that came first to mind of my own case, where I was totally preoccupied, again, as this poem says, by the pain, by the suffering of someone I loved. So it wasn't my suffering. Again, this is what I mean by C.K. Williams' poem, sometimes seeming one step removed from intimacy. It's not the narrator's pain. It's not the narrator's suffering. It's the suffering of someone else, someone the narrator loves, but not his own suffering. The blood, the coloring in the ear, is not something that the narrator of the poem has seen. It's something the narrator of the poem has seen in a photograph. Well, there's always that slight element of mitigation in Williams' poems that almost is almost the poet saying, okay, this far, but no farther. This close to me, but no closer. But the time that comes to mind for me that I remember where this happened was a case in which, in this case, the animal darting away and taking part of the pain with it is darting away because of the narrator of the poem. But it can happen either way. I'm sure that it's happened to you, where you're all caught up in your own head and then you see a Cooper's hawk take off that you didn't see resting. And suddenly, it does feel like it takes something away with it. For me, it was an animal that didn't know I was there. I was at sea and a pod of whales surfaced. And whale pods will do this. This particular pod had no children. It had no calves with it. So it was all adults. And they surface in unison. They all take these deep, enormous breaths. And they take a few of them. They'll stay at the surface doing this about 6 or 7 times, breathing the whole time. They're exchanging out oxygen and whatnot, but they're also oxygenating their blood. They're breathing a lot more than they need to, considering they can go an hour without taking a breath. They're doing a lot more than they need to because on the 7th time, they're all going to dive. They're only at the surface to soak themselves up in air. And I remember once I was on board a vessel and I was all caught up in something, and I saw that, and it really did feel like I would have said at the moment they were diving away with part of my concerns. I felt lighter when it was over, even though they had no idea what was happening, just like the doe in this poem has no idea that she's helping the narrator of the poem at all. So there you go. That is The Doe by C.K. Williams. If I remember, I mean, I'm very pleased to be doing these sonnets, but if we're going to stick with sonnets, we're going to move to the Victorian era. But if I remember, I will try to find any reviews that I've done of C.K. Williams over the years. But if I don't remember, or if I don't succeed, or if I get distracted, just keep in mind, and this is in all cases, if you are ever curious whether or not I have written anything about any author who has ever existed, just go to Google, type in my name, and type in the author's name. That usually works. And it will often remember things that I have forgotten. But I'm pretty sure I interviewed this author, and I'm pretty sure I wrote up at least one of his books. Might have been the last one. But one way or another, that is Poetry Thursday for today. And next Thursday, we will be reading the Victorians. We are going to read Victorian poetry for the month of October. So you can thank me then. Thank you, BookTube.